Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei has made his first public appearance since the US airstrikes on nuclear facilities, and he said they had achieved nothing. He claimed victory in the conflict with Israel and said the strikes amounted to little more than showmanship by President Trump.
If the intelligence reports conclude that Iran can enrich uranium to a level that concerns you, would you consider bombing the country again?
Without question, absolutely.
China is freaking out about the Israeli strike on Iran. You see, Israel just destroyed the Iranian oil refinery at Tabriz. 90% of Iranian oil goes straight to China, and now that supply is at risk. And as if that wasn't bad enough, Israel also announced that this operation will continue for a few more days. Now, China is worried that Israel may attack this small island, the Karg Island, because without this island, the Chinese economy would come to a standstill. So what's on this island, making it so crucial? And why is it becoming such a huge target? Now, before we start, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button down below. It helps us bring you great content like this on a regular basis. Now let's start with the history of Karg Island. The island itself is really small, only 7.7 square miles, or about 20 square kilometers to be precise. It wasn't useful for a lot of things, but ever since the 1950s, it has become a huge oil hub. You see, it has an ideal location to serve as an oil terminal. It's located only 25 kilometers or 16 miles off the coast of Iran, right in the Persian Gulf. And because it has deep water access, it can accommodate heavy tankers that couldn't dock at other Iranian ports. Other ports in the area are not suitable, because they are frequently hit by storms. Also, out in the southwest of Iran, most Iranian oil fields are very nearby, which is another huge advantage. These oil fields have about 10% of the global oil reserves, or about 150 billion barrels. So the National Iranian Oil Company, or the NIOC, started construction at Karg Island in 1959. They linked the island to the mainland with multiple submarine pipes, connecting the island to most of Iran's oil fields. And not before long, the oil terminal at Karg had an export capacity of millions of barrels per day, with dozens of storage tanks and docks constructed for this purpose. The Karg oil terminal could process three kinds of oil, namely light and heavy crude and offshore oil from the oil fields at sea. And the island wasn't only used as an oil terminal for exporting crude oil. In 1969, the NIOC cooperated with the American Oil Company, or Amoco, to establish the Karg Petrochemical Facility. It would turn crude oil and liquid gas into sulfur, and it would also refine oil domestically before exporting it, making Iran's exports even more valuable. At first, all of these exports were loaded onto the tankers from the island itself, but with the arrival of tankers weighing 270,000 plus tons, an artificial dock was added near the southeastern shore in 1970, and it was completed in 1974. The maximum depth at this new dock was 32 meters, meaning that it could accommodate supertankers of up to 500,000 tons. These tankers can be filled in 24 to 48 hours, and they can make the 400 nautical mile journey to the Strait of Hormuz in 24 to 30 hours. And by the time the artificial island was added, Karg was handling about 90% of Iran's total oil exports, exporting 6 million barrels per day at the peak. This provided the backbone for Iran's growing economy, because in the 1970s, Iran was regularly recording GDP growth rates in the double digits. The city of Tehran was rapidly growing, and the country was modernizing at an unprecedented pace. That sounds great, right? Well, perhaps surprisingly, the population wasn't really happy. You see, there was a lot of foreign investment in Iran's oil industry right from the get-go. Oil was discovered in 1908 by a British group of entrepreneurs, and Iran's first oil fields were developed by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become BP. The problem was that most of this oil money was going to British hands, which the population didn't like. So in 1953, the Iranian prime minister tried to nationalize the oil industry, hurting Western interests. The UK and the US didn't like this, and together the CIA and the MI6 staged a coup d'etat to overthrow the Iranian government. They reinstated the Shah, basically the king of Iran, and gave him way more authority than before, establishing him as a dictator. And the general population of Iran very much believed that he was defending foreign agendas. He was cooperating militarily with the United States and signing business deals with Western companies, which was very unpopular. When the Shah started to crack down on political opposition using his secret police called the Savak, people were getting really fed up. Now, we're talking about a military strike on Iranian oil infrastructure. And trust me, YouTube doesn't like this kind of content. It's too real, too political, too controversial. So before it gets buried, help me keep it alive. Like and subscribe to the video. Thanks so much. In 1979, huge protests broke out, organized by various different political groups. And eventually, the Shah was overthrown and replaced by Islamic extremists. These Islamists weren't the political majority by far, but they were the most ferocious and the most organized. So in the midst of the chaos, they established the Islamic Republic of Iran. This new government expelled foreign oil companies, and the NIOC became fully Iranian-run. This didn't go well initially because oil production and exports plummeted. Foreign companies left with all their technical know-how, and many expats fled in fear of persecution. Also, the Islamic Republic of Iran quickly got into a conflict with the US, the biggest market for oil, because in 1979, the hostage crisis started at the US Embassy in Tehran. 53 Americans were taken hostage by armed students for 444 days, and relations between the US and Iran broke down. Iran revolutionaries held US diplomats at gunpoint to avoid a new coup d'etat and to try to force the US to hand over the Shah, who had received asylum in the US. President Jimmy Carter called it an act of blackmail and said the diplomats were victims of terrorism and anarchy. The Shah was never handed over to the Iranians. But as a result of the crisis, the US severed diplomatic relations with Iran and imposed a round of sanctions on the country. Apart from Iran not being able to sell oil to the US, they were also blocked from importing American-made oil technology and equipment. This was a big problem, because the US dominated that market, leaving a huge gap in Iran's oil operations, including those at the Karg Island. And just a year after the Iranian Revolution, things got even worse. You see, Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, decided to invade Iran to try to expand his territory and conquer more oil fields. He was backed by the United States and Britain, who supplied Iraq with weapons and intelligence support in an effort to break the Iranian regime. Part of Saddam's strategy was to bomb the Karg Island repeatedly in order to choke the Iranian economy. The island's oil facilities were nearly destroyed, and Iran had to constantly repair them. The only reason why the island was still somewhat operational during the war was its huge initial overcapacity. Before fighting broke out, it had a maximum export capacity of 9 to 10 million barrels per day. But due to the attack, Iran also had to turn to other oil terminals for exports using smaller tankers. Throughout the war, which lasted until 1988, crude oil production in Iran was way lower than usual. It went from 6 million barrels per day before the war down to 2 to 3 million barrels per day during the war, driven largely by the attacks on Karg Island. In total, the Iran-Iraq War led to more than $1 trillion in financial losses. And the lost oil revenue played a big part in this. Now, after years of fighting and 500,000 casualties, the war finally ended in a stalemate with no major territorial changes. In this new environment after 1988, Iran entered into a slow but steady rebuilding phase, in which the oil industry played a major part. The Karg Island was rebuilt, with repaired oil loading facilities, a repaired refinery, and even new military bases to protect it during potential future attacks. Iran imported oil equipment technology from its new allies, namely Russia and China, to slowly rebuild its oil fields, pipelines, and terminals. And by the early 2000s, Iran was producing 4 million barrels of oil per day again, and it was exporting 2 million barrels of this per day. It was still not comparable to the export level before the Islamists took over, mainly because Iran couldn't sell this oil to the US, but Iran found other customers, like Japan, Europe, and emerging markets like China and India. It also started selling its oil to its neighbor, Turkey. The cheap oil supply also fueled economic growth at home, as Iran made a quick economic recovery during the 2000s. Its GDP went from $110 billion in 2000 to $640 billion in 2012. This helped the Iranian regime to stay in power, but it didn't last long. You see, Iran didn't use all the oil money to improve the quality of life at home. Instead, it began to fund proxy wars in the Middle East, like the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iran called this the axis of resistance, and the goal was to spread Iran's revolutionary Islamic ideology and to grow Iran's sphere of influence. Eventually, Iran wants to remove Israel from the map, get Western powers out of the Middle East completely, and become more powerful than the Arab nations led by Saudi Arabia. Other countries, including the United States, didn't like this agenda and continued to sanction and isolate the country. But the moment where it really went wrong was when Iran started to pursue nuclear capabilities. Because in 2002, the United States accused Iran of attempting to make nuclear weapons, which would violate the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And over the following years, Iran continued to enrich uranium closer and closer to weapon-grade levels, leading to huge tensions. So, from 2011 to 2013, the US and the EU launched huge rounds of sanctions, targeting the Iranian central bank and buyers of Iranian oil, and cutting Iran off from the SWIFT banking system. As a result, Iranian oil exports fell by more than 50%, and the Iranian economy entered a severe recession. In 2015, there was some hope with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The US, China, France, Russia, the UK, Germany, and the European Union signed a deal with Iran, who agreed to restrict its nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. But when Trump got into office in 2016, he believed that Iran was violating the agreement, so he abandoned the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and put even more crippling sanctions on Iran. These sanctions targeted the entire Iranian economy, and President Trump even threatened to sanction foreign buyers of Iranian oil. The economic crisis in Iran deepened, and it hit rock bottom in 2020, when its GDP was just 40% of the 2012 peak. Iran has slightly recovered in recent years, driven mainly by oil exports to China. This is part of the shadow oil trade, which was a way for China to avoid sanctions from the US. Basically, the Iranian tankers transferred their oil in the middle of the ocean to another tanker. These tankers are often designated by Malaysian or UAE vessels, and they switch off their transponders to avoid detection. Similar tactics are used to supply oil to other countries like India, and it allows Iran to export around 1.5 million barrels of oil per day currently. Now, that's not much compared to historical standards, but it's way more than the 400,000 barrels per day exported in 2020. Geopolitically, though, the situation hasn't improved, as tensions are only growing. Iran continues to enrich uranium, and right now it could make the nuclear material necessary for an atomic weapon in less than a week, according to some researchers. Meanwhile, conflicts in the Middle East have flared up, with the Iranian axis of resistance at the center of action. Hamas has been fighting a brutal war with Israel, and Hezbollah has joined the fight on the Lebanese border. The Houthis have also been involved, crippling global shipping lanes by attacking vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden along the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And last year, Iran got involved in the war directly by launching aerial raids on Israel on 2 different occasions. The US isn't happy with all of this, which is why we are seeing so much pressure on Iran right now. President Trump is deploying 2 aircraft carriers, squadrons of F-35 fighter jets, and B-2 bombers to the region. He wants Iran to agree to a tough nuclear deal during talks. But if that doesn't happen, he said Iran would be in great danger. And that's because during an armed conflict between Iran and the US, with Israel probably joining in on the American side, the Karg Island would most definitely be destroyed. It would cripple Iran's entire economy, because 90% of Iran's oil exports would be halted. It would cut Iran's $50 billion worth of oil revenue, destroying Iran's trade balance and crippling its government finances. Right now, more than 65% of the oil revenue from the national oil companies go to the government, which then spends a lot of it on the military and the axis of resistance. The Iranian military will also be directly hit, as it is increasingly involved in the oil business itself. The Iranian Revolutionary Corps, or the IRGC, is responsible for exporting oil, as it helps to evade sanctions with its shadow fleet, and it also operates various subsidiaries in the oil industry to get oil revenues outside of the government. This includes the Khatam Al-Biya Engineering and Construction Company, which often gets contracts from the government without competition from other companies. It's not only oil, by the way. Through its subsidiaries, the IRGC controls roughly a third of Iran's total economy, an economy that's obviously fueled by cheap oil. That might seem strange for most country standards, but in Iran, the military likes to operate out of the control of the government itself. That's because the IRGC answers directly to the supreme leader, while the government includes a semi-democratically elected president and a parliament. So the supreme leader's IRGC has a separate stream of funding to maintain absolute control. But if oil exports collapse after an attack on the Karg Island and the economy slips into a deep recession, that obviously won't work anymore. The IRGC will have a severe lack of funding, which means that the basis for the supreme leader's powers are gone. This could lead to a popular revolt, just like it did in 1979, but this time against the Islamist regime, and opposition to the dictatorship is already brewing. In 2017 to 2018, there were protests in over 80 cities against economic hardship. In November of 2019, there were once again massive protests, with as many as 1,500 people killed by government forces. In 2022, following the arrest and death of Mahsa Amini for wearing an improper hijab, there was a new protest movement across all 31 provinces, with more than 500 people killed. So if the entire economy breaks down and the regime will be at its weakest moment ever, it could be the end. Within a few weeks or months of an attack on Karg Island, the Islamic Republic of Iran will probably fall. But the obvious question is, could the US or Israel destroy the Karg Island? The short answer is yes, and the Iranians know this. After Iran's missile attack on Israel in October of 2024, tankers fled the Karg Island in anticipation of an Israeli counterattack. That just shows how vulnerable this island is. Now, the Israeli military didn't hit the Karg Island in order to de-escalate the situation, but it could have done so. Israel's F-35 Adin fighter jets can reach Iran and hit targets with precision bombs or with ballistic missiles. In the past, the Israeli Air Force has even attacked Yemen, which is even farther away. The F-35 Adin fighters would probably evade detection due to electronic jamming, but Iran's air defenses are really no match for Israel anyway. During the Israeli retaliation strike in October of 2024, Israel managed to destroy nearly all of Iran's Russian-made S-300 long-range air defense systems and all of its long-range detection radars. Iran has reportedly gotten new S-400 air defense systems from Russia, although reports are not clear on this. But even those systems are probably not good enough. And Iran's domestically produced air defense system, called the Bavar 373, is also not sufficient. These air defense systems could probably shoot down drones and cruise missiles, But with smart tactics, Israel's 6th-generation fighter jets with advanced missiles will probably score hits. And against the United States, well, there's no shot that Iran could defend the Karg Island. The US has aircraft carriers, B-2 bombers, and many more aircraft stationed in allied nations like Saudi Arabia. It also has destroyers, cruisers, and submarines equipped with Tomahawk missiles, which can easily hit the island. Combined, the US forces can easily overwhelm and destroy Iran's air defenses and swarm the oil terminal. The US could opt for total destruction or for satellite-guided strikes. The latter would destroy oil storage tanks, vessels, and loading facilities while limiting unnecessary casualties. The US and Israel would probably also strike other Iranian oil terminals. Iran has built one other export facility called the Jask terminal on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. It's connected to the oil fields of Iran's southwest by a huge offshore pipeline called the Gorey-Jask pipeline, and another offshore pipeline. This bypasses the Karg Island, but currently it has nowhere near the capacity to fully replace the Karg Island terminals. And even if it did, somewhere in the future, the US or Israel could just strike the Jask terminal just as well, with similar devastating consequences. But despite it being so easy and having such a devastating effect on Iran, the US or Israel have never attacked Iran's oil terminals before. In part, that's because it would lead to a full-scale war, which can only end if the Iranian regime falls. Israel or the United States would have to commit to this conflict, which would not be very popular at home. Meanwhile, they would have to wipe out Iran's nuclear facilities in hours or days, because attacking the Karg Island would definitely prompt the Iranians to build their first nuclear bomb. Israel and the United States and the entire Middle East want to prevent this at all costs. Also, destroying the Iranian oil exports would have a devastating effect on the global oil market. Although estimates vary because the shadow fleet is kind of hard to track, Iran is probably within the top 10 oil exporters globally. Without Iran's oil supply, prices would go up significantly, probably to $85 to $100 per barrel. It would affect consumers all around the world, even in the US. Even though the US might not buy Iranian oil, China would try to buy oil from other countries, leading to a huge shortage in supply, on and on. Because it would cause a new wave of inflation, it's not really the preferred option for President Trump, because he wants to keep his approval rating. The only scenario where an attack on Karg would make sense is when it was coordinated with the other Gulf countries. You see, countries like Saudi Arabia could easily make up for the lost exports from Iran if they just up their production capacity. In fact, they would be more than willing to do so because it means more money for them. During Trump's 2018 sanctions on Iran, that's exactly what happened, with Saudi Arabia stepping in to prevent inflation. However, the Gulf nations would have trouble agreeing to a full-scale attack on Iran, because the response could be devastating. The supreme leader of Iran could think that when he goes down, he'll just take everyone with him. Iran could block the Strait of Hormuz, just like the Houthis have done at the Bab al-Mandab Strait. It could do this with missiles and drone barrages, or by mining the strait. And it's hard to describe just how devastating this would actually be. It would cut off all the oil exports from the Gulf nations, meaning more than 40% of the global oil exports would be halted. It would cause an unprecedented regional crisis and a global recession, if not a depression. Ultimately, it's a scenario where the Iranian regime does not make it out alive, because Iran would collapse sooner than the rest of the world, but it would cause a lot of pain for the region and for the rest of the world, which is probably just not worth it. So let's hope it never comes to such a violent escalation, and that the United States and Iran can strike a new deal to secure peace. But in a real war scenario, the Karg Island is the reason why the Islamic Republic of Iran would not survive. Thanks for watching.